We've had 3 heavy sermons so far these holy days. So this morning, something a little lighter. Over the past several years, I've tried to devote at least one High Holy Day sermon to lessons we can learn from either a book, movie, or TV show. This year, I want to share with you some insights from the book, The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. The book introduces us to Nora Seed 19 years before she decided to die. She is in her school library playing chess with the librarian, Mrs. Elm. Mrs. Elm was the person most on Nora's wavelength in the entire school, and most days, Nora would spend her afternoon break in the school library. Mrs. Elm encourages Nora, saying, "With a brain like yours, you can do anything." One afternoon, Mrs. Elm takes a phone call. Nora's father has died of a sudden heart attack. Fast forward 19 years. 27 hours before Nora decided to die, she sat on her dilapidated sofa, scrolling through other people's happy lives, waiting for something to happen. She'd been feeling lonely. An acquaintance, Ash, a surgeon who'd once asked her out for coffee, knocks on her door to tell her he thinks her cat, Voltaire, who is lying in the street, is dead. She goes out to see, finds Voltaire's body, and really, rather than feeling pity and despair, she feels envy. After burying Voltaire and sleeping restlessly, she arrives at work at String Theory, a music store, to find out she is being fired. In the course of the conversation with her boss, we learn that Nora had gone to university for a year before returning to Bedford to take care of her dying mother. She had backed out of marrying her fiancé, Dan, 2 days before the wedding, and she had been in a band called The Labyrinths with her now estranged brother, Joe, and his friend, Ravi. Nora wanders around Bedford in search of a reason to exist. It begins to rain, and she ducks into a newsstand. She sees a National Geographic, which reminds her of her father and how she had once wanted to be a glaciologist. She has an awkward encounter with Ravi, who still holds her responsible for the Labyrinth's breakup. The woman behind the counter recognizes Nora from school. Hearing that Nora is unmarried and has no kids, she warns Nora, tick-tock, tick-tock. We learn that Nora broke her engagement with Dan because he wanted children, and she'd been petrified of motherhood due to the rocky relationship she had with her parents and that they had had with each other. In freefall, Nora reaches out to her former best friend, Izzy, who was living in Australia. Izzy had asked Nora to join her after her breakup with Dan, but Nora had declined. She sends Izzy a text, but receives no response. She continues wandering. She tries to give a homeless man some money, but realizes she has none. She receives a call from Doreen, the mother of her sole piano student, Leo. They've been waiting outside her apartment for over an hour for Leo's lesson. Doreen intimates that this is it. Leo is done with lessons. On her way home, Nora passes her elderly neighbor, Mr. Banerjee, to whom she delivers his medications monthly. Mr. Banerjee tells Nora she won't need to do this anymore, as the boy from the pharmacy has moved close by and offered to deliver them. That was it. Nora determines that no one needs her. She is superfluous to the universe. She takes 2 antidepressant tablets. 3 hours before she decided to die, the book reads, her whole being ached with regret, as if the despair in her mind was somehow in her torso and limbs too, as if it had colonized every part of her. It reminded her that everyone was better off without her. Nora scrolls through her social media. No messages, no comments, no likes, no friend requests. She sees that everyone has worked out how to live, except her. She feels that her life, which could have gone in wonderful directions, now went nowhere at all. Every move had been a mistake, every decision a disaster, every day a step away from who she'd imagined she'd be. Swimmer, musician, philosopher, spouse, traveler, glaciologist, happy, loved. But she was none of those things. Nora finishes the bottle of wine she had opened upon her arrival home. She calls her brother and leaves a goodbye voicemail, writes a suicide note, and decides that it is a very good time to die. Nora finds herself standing on a path outside a building. She looks at the digital display on her watch. Midnight. She waits for the next second to arrive, but it doesn't. With nothing else to do, she heads inside the building and finds there a seemingly endless number of books. The books are all various shades of green, all the same height, but of varying widths. She is about to touch one of them when she hears a voice and turns to see Mrs. Elm, who explains that she is in the Midnight Library, caught between life and death. Each of the books in the library contains a possible life that Nora could have lived had she changed just one thing. Because, Mrs. Elm explains, if you change one thing, you change everything. Between life and death, she tells Nora, there is a library. And within that library, the shelves go on forever. Every book provides a chance to try another life you could have lived, to see how things would be different if you had made other choices. Would you have done anything different if you had the chance to undo your regrets? The books begin to move. What's happening? Nora asks. Mrs. Elm tells Nora that she has infinite possible lives wherein she made different choices, which in turn lead to different outcomes. And the books are portals to those lives. Nora now has the opportunity to live out different lives based on different choices she could have made. But before she can start, she must confront one book, which is the source of all her problems, the book of regrets. Every regret Nora has ever had since the day she was born is recorded in the book of regrets. Nora opens the heavy book and begins to read. I regret the time spent on social media, not exercising more, not telling my father I loved him before he died, not staying in the labyrinths, not doing more for the environment, not going to Australia with Izzy, not learning to be a happier person, not becoming a glaciologist, not marrying Dan. Nora's regrets become overwhelming. She closes the book. Mrs. Elm tells her it's time to choose which life she wants to live. She explains that each life could last for seconds, hours, days, months. Or if she finds a life Nora truly wants to live, she will get to live it until she dies of old age. However, if she experiences disappointment in a life, she will return to the Midnight Library. Mrs. Elm reminds Nora that while she is between lives, if she were to lose the will to carry on, it will affect her original life, her root life. Or it could lead to the destruction of the Midnight Library, in which case Nora would die. Nora chooses to live the life where she marries Dan. Mrs. Elm locates the book. Nora opens it and finds herself standing outside a country pub. She sees that she and Dan have realized his dream of running a country pub. She thinks they must be happy. But in short order, she learns that the pub is in financial trouble and that Dan has cheated on her. She feels herself fading away and finds herself back in the Midnight Library. Next, Nora chooses the life where she was a good cat owner and kept Voltaire indoors. Back in her bedroom, she calls for the cat. When he doesn't come, she searches the house for him and finally finds him lying dead under her bed. Back in the Midnight Library, Mrs. Elm tells Nora that Voltaire had a serious case of cardiomyopathy, which he was born with. Nothing she could have done would have prevented his death. The year he had with Nora was the best of his life, and he had loved Nora as much as she loved him. So you see, she says, Sometimes regrets aren't based on fact at all. Sometimes regrets are just a load of BS. Next, Nora chooses the life in which she had gone to Australia with Izzy, only to find out that Izzy had recently died in a head-on car crash. Nora returns to the Midnight Library. She tells Mrs. Elm she doesn't want to continue. Mrs. Elm wisely replies, "The only way to learn is to live." Nora chooses next the life where she didn't give up swimming. In this life, she made it to the Olympics twice, winning 2 silver medals and a gold. She is a sought-after motivational speaker. Her father is still alive in this life and has divorced her mother and remarried. Her brother is a recovering alcoholic, and her mother drank herself to death following the divorce. She's back in the Midnight Library. This time, however, there seems to be a problem. The lights are glitchy. Nora deduces that she may be dying in her root life. All of a sudden, she feels a shift. The idea of death suddenly troubles her. The error corrects itself. Nora remembers that she once wanted to be a glaciologist and chooses that life next. She wakes up in a little cabin on a boat in Svalbard in the Arctic Circle. Nora has drawn the short straw today, meaning that while the rest of the crew is doing their research work, she stands watch with a rifle, a flare gun, and instructions on how to ward off polar bears. Sure enough, after a while she hears a splashing sound. A polar bear appears and moves toward her. Nora fires the flare gun, but then realizes that the rifle is out of reach. She grabs a pot and ladle and bangs as hard as she can, yelling, "Bear! Bear!" at the top of her voice. The banging isn't working and the bear comes closer. In this moment, Nora suddenly realizes she doesn't want to die. Eventually, the bear turns and slips back into the water as her colleagues finally come to her rescue. Later, another researcher named Hugo corners Nora and admits he knows she is what he calls a slider, going in and out of her possible lives. He is also a slider. Having this in common, they become quite friendly, if you catch my drift. But ultimately, Nora is disillusioned and slips back to the Midnight Library. Mrs. Elm notes Nora's change of attitude toward dying and points out that the Book of Regrets is growing progressively lighter. Next, Nora chooses the life where she stayed with the band. She finds that in this life, the labyrinths are big, playing to sold-out stadiums every night. She realizes she is capable of a lot more than she had previously known. But she also learns that her brother had died by suicide some time ago. Back in the Midnight Library, Nora realizes that every life she has tried so far has really been someone else's dream. It's time to choose her own dream. Nora tries many other lives. She is an American winery owner with her Mexican husband, a college English teacher in France, a lifeguard in Spain, a published author, a mother, a concert pianist, a travel vlogger, a tabloid newspaper columnist, the picture editor at National Geographic, an eco-architect, an aid worker in Botswana, a cat sitter, a volunteer in a homeless shelter, a music teacher in Montreal, a chess champion, and many more. In some lives, Nora attracted a lot of attention, and in other lives, none. In some lives, she was rich, and in others, poor. She has been a rock star, an Olympian, a primary school teacher, a professor, a CEO, a physician's assistant, a chef, a glaciologist, a climatologist, an acrobat, a tree planter, an audit manager, a hairdresser, a professional dog walker, an office clerk, a software developer, a receptionist, a hotel cleaner, a politician, a lawyer, a shoplifter, the head of an ocean protection charity, a waitress, a first-line supervisor, a glassblower, and 1,000 other things. And between lives, she always sees Mrs. Elm in the Midnight Library. But Nora realizes that living all these lives is no longer fun. She needs to find a life in which to land. Mrs. Elm notes that Nora is forgetting who she is. In becoming everyone, she becomes no one. Nora picks the life in which she said yes to Ash's invitation to coffee. She wakes up with a man next to her in bed with rings on her finger. She gets up, planning to do some research about herself on her phone, but as she exits the bedroom, she sees a small human in front of her, her daughter Molly, who has had a nightmare. As she calms Molly, she plays a game with her, asking questions that Molly knows the answers to, and learns quite a bit about herself and her family in this life. She learns that she is on sabbatical from her university teaching job to write a book, that Ash is still a surgeon who plays music very badly, and that her brother, who is gay, is happily married, and that she has a dog named Plato. They are well-read, they live in a nice house in a nice town, and there are many photos of their extended family throughout the house. This is a good life, she determines. Maybe this is it. I could be happy here, she muses. She spends the next several weeks living a normal life, going to yoga class, watching TV, taking Molly to the park, visiting her brother and his husband. She realizes that she truly loves Molly and is grateful to be with Ash. There are many moments of joy and laughter and love. One day, Nora decides to go see an old friend in Bedford, Mrs. Elm, who in a different life was living in a residential care home. As she enters the building, she sees Mr. Banerjee, who is distressed. Mr. Banerjee doesn't know her. Nora asks to see Mrs. Elm and is told she died 3 weeks ago. She starts to wander around her old neighborhood, and as she does, she realizes she has changed. She is stronger now, having untapped things inside her which she might never have known about had she not sung in an arena or fought off a polar bear or felt so much love and fear and courage. There is a commotion. 2 boys are being arrested. One of them was Leo, her piano student in her root life. She learns that Leo has been in trouble before. This time he stole from a store and has a concealed weapon. Nora starts to feel herself weaken. She knows what it means, but still she says, "This is a good life. This is a good life." She walks a little farther and finds that string theory is closed, out of business. She drives back to Cambridge saying, "This is the best life," but knowing she didn't have much longer there. She rushes back home and has just enough time to tell Ash and Molly and Plato that she loves them before she finds herself back in the Midnight Library. The library is in a state of active destruction. Nora and Mrs. Elm worry that perhaps Nora is dying in her root life. The computer begins to smoke. The ceiling is falling down, and even more distressing, the books are starting to catch on fire. The fire spreads rapidly as the display on Nora's watch starts to move off midnight. When Nora demands to know why she's back there, Mrs. Elm tells her, "One thing is clear, you didn't want that life." Nora responds, "It was the perfect life," but with some prompting realizes that she wasn't truly happy there all the time. It wasn't her life. Nora cries out, "I don't want to die." Mrs. Elm tells her that among all the books that are burning, there is one that isn't, and she needs to find it quickly. She tells Nora, "You came back here this time, not because you wanted to die, but because you want to live. The library isn't falling down because it wants to kill you. It's falling down because it is giving you a chance to return. You have decided you want to be alive. Now go on, live while you still have the chance." Then she said, "Things will get better, Nora. It's going to be all right." Mrs. Elm hands Nora an orange plastic fountain pen and tells her she will need it when she finds the right book because that story isn't written yet. As the clock ticks down, she finally locates the book. It is the book of her root life with the future unwritten. It is nearly 1 minute past midnight. She writes, Nora wanted to live. Nothing. She tries, Nora decided to live. Nothing. Nora was ready to live. Still nothing. Finally, she writes, I am alive. And with that, the midnight library dissolves into dust, and Nora wakes up in her apartment, alive, but just barely. Nora is sitting in a hospital bed, her stomach pumped. She assures the doctor and nurses that yes, she wants to live. Her brother arrives and they reconcile. She sees that Izzy has texted and she responds. Back at home, she sees Mr. Banerjee, who is grateful to see her alive. She gets a call from Doreen, who tells her Leo will continue his lessons. Nora decides to teach piano lessons and in short order is inundated with students. She visits Mrs. Elm at the Oak Leaf Care Home and offers to visit daily. As they play chess, Nora says, You're going to win this. Mrs. Elm responds, Well, that's the beauty, isn't it? You just never know how it ends. Nora smiles as she thinks about her next move. The moment I finished reading this book, I knew I had to share it with you. I was and remain deeply moved by the lessons found within. The Midnight Library is a story about choices, regrets, and the pursuit of fulfillment. Each book represents a different life choice and the alternate realities that could have unfolded. I find myself reflecting deeply on Mrs. Elm's question. Would you have done anything differently if you had the chance to undo your regrets? The High Holy Days are about reflection, repentance, and renewal. Reflection during these days prompts us to consider our paths and the impact of our decisions. We are obligated to do cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of the soul. On this holiest of days, we must ask ourselves, what have I done or not done this past year that I regret? The miracle of Yom Kippur is that it actually does give us the opportunity to undo our regrets. True, we can't go back and make a different choice, but we can repair our own lives and the lives of others impacted by our choices. This is the true meaning of teshuvah. But cheshbon hanefesh doesn't mean accounting for only our regrets. Nora learned by living alternate lives to pay attention to positive traits and the impact and influence she can have on others. Because she noticed Leo's musical talent and encouraged him to develop it, he stayed out of trouble and likely grew up to be a musician, bringing beauty to a wounded world. Because she looked after Mr. Banerjee, he was able to live out his remaining days at home. Nora's daily visits to Mrs. Elm made sure she did not die a lonely, forgotten old former librarian. And Nora's love and encouragement enabled her troubled brother to find love. By reflecting on the good we do in our personal lives, in the community, and in the world, we strengthen ourselves and amplify our positive actions. We hardly ever learn of the impact we have on others' lives. However, I assure you, it is profound. This morning we read from Parashat Nitzavim, which speaks about standing together as a community before God and the importance of choice and commitment. Verses 19 and 20 of Deuteronomy chapter 30 tells us we have a choice. We can choose life and blessing or death and curses. Choose life, God tells us. Our Haftarah this morning is a sharp indictment of the notion that ritual practice and moral behavior can exist in separate realms. Isaiah reminds us that God doesn't want our fasts if we're just going to turn around and oppress our laborers, ignore the poor and hungry and unhoused, and so on. In other words, we must not enter Yom Kippur under the assumption that fasting and prayer alone can bring about atonement for our sins. If we spend the day fervently engaged in ritual activities and then return to our lives as if nothing has changed, as if spiritual self-reflection has nothing to do with how we conduct ourselves in the world, then we have missed the point entirely. Going through the motions of Yom Kippur with a sense of complacency about the problems of the world around us is, according to Isaiah, a fundamentally un-Jewish way of relating to God. We have the power to choose how we live our lives. Yom Kippur invites us to explore our values and beliefs, leading to personal growth and understanding, returning to our truest and best selves. We can focus on what's wrong and believe that we don't matter, or we can choose life and be the blessing God knows each and every one of us can be. This Yom Kippur, I encourage you to take time for self-reflection. What choices have led you to your current path? If you could undo any regret, what would it be, and how will you go about it? What new choices can you make moving forward? My prayer as we enter 5785 is that this be the year we live without regret, that we pay attention to the positive impact we have on others and they on us, that we live with courage and a sense of adventure, and above all, love, and that we choose life. Gemar Chatima Tova, may you be sealed for goodness, blessing, and life.